So today we often say, because of technology, geography has become irrelevant. Or others say, geography is still what determines everything. However, according to this author, Robert Kaplan, both camps are wrong. The truth is somewhere in the middle. Hello readers, I'm the Avid Reader, and today we're reviewing The Revenge of Geography by Robert Kaplan. This is a geopolitical book by Robert Kaplan which tracks the history of the development of geopolitical thought, while also using geopolitics along with some other stuff to analyze different regions. Robert Kaplan is a realist, and he believes that geography is the most important factor, but he's not a geographical determinist. He believes more in something called probabilistic determinism or partial determinism, where geography already limits us a lot, but within the contours of that we can do a lot because of human volition. And this book is split up into 3 parts. In the first part of the book, Robert Kaplan talks about the history of geopolitical thought. But before he does that, he begins by talking about how during the 90s you had the pinnacle of liberal humanism, where the wars in Yugoslavia, some believe, demonstrated that you could disregard realist power politics now. Now we just need to think about human rights, as we saw with the bombing of Serbia to liberate Kosovo in the late 90s. But then this idea fell flat with the Iraq war, where geography, of course, screwed things up, created anarchy. So while Saddam Hussein was bad, according to Robert Kaplan, what came right after him was worse, the anarchy, where people were killing each other very much. Robert Kaplan is careful to say that you don't go to either extreme, where you disregard geography completely or you disregard human rights completely. You need to take a bit of both to determine the best foreign policy. And he talks about different concepts of geopolitics that have developed. So there's the Eurasian heartland idea. So that's the idea that geopolitics pivots around the heartland, which is mainly Central Asia, Afghanistan, Iran, and who controls that region can control the world. And this is kind of, but not really, opposed to the Rimland thesis, where what really matters are the literal countries around the world. So, for example, Europe, you have a bunch of countries that border the Atlantic, or you have China that borders different seas, or India. All these rimland literal nations, that's what really matters. And Kaplan argues that you can combine these two theories to better understand geopolitics. And then there's the idea that sea power has become more important than land power now. And this is a general theme throughout Robert Kaplan's books, which I also generally agree with, because the point with sea power is that it's mainly for defense. It cannot be really an oppressive force. You cannot conquer a nation or oppress a people with a navy, but it is useful to defend liberty from invaders. And of course, the most important aspect of the US military is its navy patrolling the world, keeping trade free and things like that. And this is a lot less of a threat to international stability and liberty than using an army, for instance. Robert Kaplan says that the two factors of globalization and the growing population is going to create more dynamic conflicts, as we're gonna become a more crowded earth now. You're gonna have people radicalizing in more urban cities, either demanding for democracy or other radical things. So a lot of dictatorships that have been quasi-stable are gonna destabilize. This book, written in 2012, is written quite soon after the Arab Spring, so that's kind of happened. You did not really have that much of democratization, but you had a lot of instability in the Greater Middle East. Robert Kaplan has this concept. He talks about the Greater Middle East, which is basically the Muslim world from North Africa all the way to Pakistan, as there's no really clear borders here. The borders on the map are not necessarily the true borders of how different countries influence each other. Moving on to part 2, which is one I think that Robert Kaplan gets really interesting in this book. You have him diving into geopolitical analysis of different regions. So he starts out with Europe, of course. And that is because Europe is the original model to think about geopolitics. The guys who developed geopolitics were mainly a bunch of British guys. And they based off their research and their theories off of Europe. And of course, Europe has a geography that promotes maritime dynamism, which eventually facilitate liberal humanist values, which we've seen culminate in the European Union itself. And Germany will be the main European power because they're both situated between the western part of Europe and Central Europe. Then Robert Kaplan talks about Russia, And Russia has a very high latitude, so most of Russia is very cold. Because of Russia's geography of cold forests and steep plains, this promotes despotism, as from the steppe you have invaders, but then the Russians can retreat to the forests. But then to guarantee security, the Russians have to expand and expand and expand. And the Eurasian steppe land is gigantic. So that's why Russia is gigantic. And that's why Russia has imperialist tendencies. But Kaplan argues that if Russia really wants to keep its sphere of influence, it should be promoting its cultural Eurasianism, because you're having Islam that's being radicalized in European Russia, in the Caucasus, for instance, as the Muslims are reproducing a lot faster than the ethnic Russians in that country. And then in Central Asia, they have a lot of minerals and they can kind of rely on China, so they don't need Russia really for them to succeed. Kazakhstan is quite a rich economy actually because of energy. So Russia needs to convince these countries to be within its sphere of influence. It cannot force them into it. Coercion is not the answer, according to Kaplan. But of course, Russia has imperialist ambitions in Ukraine, for instance. And when they attacked Georgia in 2008, that was a clear sign that Russia is not a status quo power, but instead that they want to change the situation. And that is what we indeed saw with the Russian invasion of Ukraine in 2022. Robert Kaplan moves on to China. And he says that China, they have decent geography, so it's not great, but it's at a similar latitude to the United States, so it's not that hard to grow food, for instance. And of course, as China is developing economically, that creates power ambitions. And of course, with China developing economically, that creates external ambitions. So that creates the wish of China to become the regional hegemon in the Eastern Hemisphere, especially in its backyard. So in the East China Sea, South China Sea, for example, in Southeast Asia. And they especially want to take back Taiwan. But of course, the United States would lose face in front of its allies if it's just yielded Taiwan to China. And Kaplan says that it's more likely in the long run that China becomes more open instead of less repressive. That's because you have a bunch of Chinese people of the middle class who have visited Taiwan, and of course Taiwan is a free country, so they see the free media in Taiwan and they get inspired of that when they return to China. Things have worsened under Xi Jinping in China, but who knows, it could actually liberalize under the next dictator in China. If China is more open, then of course it's easier for it to reclaim Taiwan. Kaplan said China does not want war, but you could have a war just by miscalculation, although that's not that likely. And historically you have had a bunch of countries that have been artificially split, but then they've reunited, so Vietnam, Yemen, and Germany, for instance. But you still have North and South Korea split apart, and the horrible regime in North Korea. But eventually, the regime in North Korea will collapse, and then they will reunite with Seoul as the likely dominant center of Korea. But as Korea dislikes China less than they dislike Taiwan, they may actually be tilted towards China instead of towards the USA and Japan under a united Korea. So it wouldn't necessarily be that bad for China for a reunited Korea. And American troops are likely to leave different parts of Asia eventually. And Kaplan actually advocates for a better strategy of how the USA should eventually redeploy its troops in Asia. That's its main base should be in Guam, as that's a US territory. So there they can position troops without getting problems from the locals, as they have gotten problems from the locals in Okinawa, for example. They could station a bunch of troops and bases along a slew of islands in the Indo-Pacific, or on islands, for example, off the coast of Africa and Australia, and in collaboration with India. So that would mean that the Chinese Navy would become the main power in its own region, but it wouldn't necessarily be oppressive. As has already been said, navies tend to be less oppressive than armies, and it's in everyone's interest to have the free trade open now. Next, Robert Kaplan talks about India, and the thing with India is that they worry about Pakistan a lot more than China. And that's because China and India, they have Himalayan mountains that make a natural barrier between the two civilizations. So although they're right next to each other, geographically they're separated clearly. You don't have that with Pakistan, and they are existential threats for each other, India and Pakistan, as both have nukes. So although India is stronger than Pakistan, if a war ever broke out, it could escalate to nukes. And as this was written in 2012, this was written when you had nation building in Afghanistan and the Taliban were insurgents still. And it was in the interest of India to have a moderate, stable regime in Afghanistan, as it's in the interest of a bunch of powers in Eurasia to have a transport corridor, which is a trade route that would go through Central Asia and India, through Afghanistan, all the way up to Europe to export energy and different products. Next, Robert Kaplan talks about Iran and Turkey and the greater Middle East. And these are the strongest states in the Middle East, and that's because Iran is on a plateau and Turkey is kind of a peninsula. They have the Black Sea on the north side, and then they have the Mediterranean on the south side, which makes these two states much more coherent than the other countries in the Middle East. Turkey and Iran, they're both collaborators and competitors, so they don't have any long-run animosity between each other. Turkey has, for example, helped Iran circumvent sanctions, and Turkey has also industrialized, and they have a decent middle class, so they're a middle to high income nation, you could say, and they industrialized without oil, so they are a dynamic economy with good demographics, which makes them the likely main power in the Middle East, with Iran as a second runner. Because Iran, although they have their Islamic mullah regime, they still have a lot of different institutions, such as the president, the supreme leader, the clerics. They have the institutions that would allow them to liberalize. And in the Middle East, you have this youth bulge, which will challenge the different autocratic regimes, so the Arab monarchies and the Iranian theocracy, and also the Arab republics. Iraq, although the war was a quagmire in a sense, they did kind of establish a more liberal democratic regime than what you had previously. And as you have Iraq that's very friendly with Iran, you have Shiites in Iran who may be influenced by the more moderate Shiites in Iraq, which of course makes it easier for Iran to eventually liberalize. Now, Turkey has in recent decades turned more Islamist, and there are two main reasons for this. One, the EU has rejected them. So Turkey really wanted to join the EU in the 90s, and they were doing their best to be a secular democracy in a sense, but that never happened. And two, the secular regime in Turkey has been militarily imposed. So Westernization has been associated with the Turkish oppressive military that's kind of anti-democratic. This means that the Islamic movement in Turkey is inherently democratic, and they are a lot more moderate than what you have in Iran or in the Arab world. It's in the West's interest that if you have a dominant power in the Middle East, it ought to be Turkey. And Robert Kaplan says that the Arab Spring in a sense benefited Turkey. And you can see that while Turkey has become more Islamist, they haven't really turned that much away from the West. They're still in NATO. They still engage and recognize Israel. However, they at the same time back the separatists in Gaza. They send humanitarian aid to them. And they are also attempting to spread influence throughout the Middle East. And Robert Kaplan says that Syria and Lebanon, they're likely to collapse eventually because they're not that coherent states. In Lebanon, for example, Hezbollah is more powerful than the Lebanese government itself. And then in Syria, you have a split between the Sunnis and Shias. So there are parts of Syria that it would make more sense for them to be united with Iraq, for example. And there are parts of Lebanon and Syria, it would make more sense for them to be together. So of course the regime in Syria is very brutal, but eventually it's likely to collapse unless it reforms, and it's unlikely to reform. And you still have a civil war in Syria going on for what? About a decade now. Now in Jordan, Robert Kaplan says that it's likely that the regime will reform because you have a united elite that has not been killing each other like in the Arab republics of Syria and Iraq. So the absolute monarchy in Jordan, it's likely to eventually turn into more of a constitutional monarchy. Robert Kaplan also talks about that democratization throughout the Middle East. It depends whether it's in the interest or not of the West on a case-by-case basis. For example, according to him, it's in the West's interest for Iran to democratize, as they have their ancient civilized Persian traditions, while Jordan, if they democratize, they are gonna have more Islamist elements probably, so that's not that good for the West. In the final part of this book, Robert Kaplan focuses on the United States and Mexico specifically, because a bunch of realists were angry with the Iraq and Afghanistan wars post 9/11 because they thought it's much more important for the USA to focus on what's happening in Mexico and with Mexicans coming to America. For example, you have Samuel Huntington, who feared that the coming migrations of Mexicans into America would dilute the Anglo-Protestant culture and create a split in the United States between the Catholic Hispanic culture and then the Anglo-Protestant culture. Robert Kaplan acknowledges that there's a problem, but he doesn't believe in Samuel Huntington's solution of trying to really preserve an Anglo-Protestant nation. Because Mexicans who come to the United States, they do have a similar work ethic to the Protestant work ethic anyways. And instead you should have the United States more going towards a bilingual nation. And Mexico is very unstable with the drug cartels. Some places are extremely violent, especially in the north of Mexico. It's in the United States' self-interest to turn Mexico into a developed first world stable nation, because Mexico has a quite big population. If you take Mexico and Central America together, that's about half the population size of the United States, something like 150 million. So on the international scene, it would be really good for the United States to have Mexican backing, and a wealthy, stable Mexico at that. So what is the general conclusion of Robert Kaplan's book, The Revenge of Geography? Well, it is that you need to have balancing powers throughout the world, because a balance of power is the best way to promote cosmopolitan, liberal values in the long run. So, how would I rate The Revenge of Geography by Robert Kaplan? I'm gonna give it an 8 out of 10, and a strong 8. So, out of the 4 Robert Kaplan books I've read so far, I would rank this as my second favorite, behind Asia's Cauldron. So there's a lot of good analysis in this book. Robert Kaplan balances pretty well geography and ideas in their importance. He's not a complete determinist in the same way that someone like Peter Zeihan is. And that's very important to international relations. International relations, you need to draw from several sources. You need an eclectic approach to understand it. I really do appreciate his moderate geographical realism, but with a liberal, humanist, democratic bent, and he's very nuanced in his analysis. Now, this book was written in 2012, right after the Arab Spring, you could say, so it's maybe a little over-optimistic in how many different countries their best bet is to democratize and liberalize, and that is true. It's just that in some regions is less likely than others. You can tell that this book is from 2012 in a couple of aspects. So China has become more repressive now, which is not what Kaplan expected. And then you have Turkey, which their Islamism, it's not that democratic in the end. Erdogan has been quite autocratic. But those are just a couple minor gripes I have with this book. I don't have any major gripes with this book. I think he meanders on a bit too much in the first part of this book when giving his history of geopolitical thought, but I did really love his geopolitical analysis of different regions. And Kaplan looks at these countries from a different angle compared with how he did in Monsoon, so he does not repeat himself in the same way that someone like Peter Zeihan does in his books. So would I recommend The Revenge of Geography? Yes, without a doubt, you should read this book. But that's my point of view of The Revenge of Geography. What do you readers think? Do you think that Robert Kaplan's moderate realism is correct, or do you think that a hardcore realist approach to the world would be better, or more of a liberal idealist approach to analyze international relations, or maybe some other approach? Let me know what you think in the comments below. Anyways, if you want to learn more about Robert Kaplan's books, then I would recommend you to check out this playlist of where I have reviewed several of Robert Kaplan's books. With that said, I'm the average reader, and I will see you readers next time.